Hilchos Issurei Biah Perek Shiva Asar. The Laws of Forbidden Relationships, chapter 17. We are moving into a new section of these laws for the next 4 chapters. It's called Issurei Kehuna. Special prohibitions that apply to Kohanim, the priests, and the high priests, who they are not allowed to marry. And we begin with the list. It says that Rambam Halacha Aleph Shalosh Nashim Nesru Al Kol HaKoyanim. There are 3 women that are prohibited to every Kohen to marry. Gerusha, Zaina, V'Chalola. A divorced woman, which we're going to define later in this chapter. A Zaina. Zaina literally means a prostitute, but we're going to define this tomorrow as a woman who engaged in a forbidden relationship. V'Chalola and a Chalala literally means desecrated woman. We're going to define this in chapter 19 as meaning any woman who is born as a product of a union involving a Kohen with someone he was forbidden to marry. So if a Kohen would marry a divorcee, she would become a Chalala, she becomes desecrated, plus any children that they have are also going to be a Chalal or a Chalala. So these 3 women are forbidden to every Kohen. This is actually clear in the verse on the screen, which describes the Kohanim. It says, Isha Zaina v'Chalala lo yikachu. They shall not take for themselves a prostitute or a desecrated woman. V'Isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu. Nor should they take a woman divorced from her husband, ki kadosh hu le'lekav, because he's holy to his God. It's part of the holiness of a Kohen. It doesn't just marry anybody. Now, Kohen Gadol arba, says the Rambam further, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, he has 4 women prohibited for him to marry. Elu hashalish, the same 3 we mentioned before, divorcee, forbidden relationship, and product of a forbidden Kohen relationship, veha almana, and a widow. Any widowed woman is forbidden to the high priest. You can see this in this verse here, where it says about the Kohen Gadol, who isha vivsuleha yikach, he has to marry a virgin girl, which we're going to expound on later in this chapter. And it says clearly, almana, ugrusha, v'chalala, zaina, 4 women, a widow, a divorcee, desecrated, prostitute, es eila lo yikach, he shall not take these, ki im besula me'amav yikach isha, instead, he should only take a virgin from his nation. And these are very important words. They're going to come up in a second. V'lo yechalo zarei ba'amav. The prohibition is described as he should not desecrate his children. That's the reason why we're forbidding him to marry these women. Now, first of all, the Rambam has to define what's a high priest. Because we know the high priest is the highest Kohen, the one who wears, these fancy special clothes over and above the 4 garments worn by a regular Kohen. But in earlier times, there was 2 ways for a Kohen Gadol to enter office. One was he was anointed with the Shemen HaMishcha, the special anointing oil. But that oil went out of use in the end of the First Temple era. After that, the way you entered the office of Kohen Gadol was simply by donning the 8 garments. So the Rambam says the prohibitions to a Kohen Gadol apply to both. Echad Kohen Gadol mashuach b'Shemen HaMishcha, oy hameruba begadim. Whether the Kohen Gadol was anointed with the anointing oil, or he simply entered office by increasing the number of his garments. Ve'echad Kohen ha'oived, ve'echad Kohen Gadol sheminuhu ve'avar. It's also true whether you are holding office currently, a Kohen Gadol who is currently serving, or a high priest who was appointed and removed from office. There are some situations where it calls for impeaching the Kohen Gadol. He did some unseemly things, or whatever it might be. Nevertheless, even after he leaves office, he retains that status, that holiness of the Kohen Gadol, and he cannot marry all 4 women. And also the Kohen who is anointed for war. This is going to be described in the very last section of laws, in the 14th book of the Rambam, when the Rambam describes the laws of war. So there's a special law that there was a Kohen who was appointed for war to give the Jews a pep talk before they left, to encourage them in their fight. He, while he wasn't fully a Kohen Gadol, he couldn't serve in the temple, but he did have some of the status, some of the holiness of the Kohen Gadol applied to him. Kulan, mitzuvin, alabsula, va'asurin, ba'almana, all of these types of Kohen Gadols are all commanded to marry a virgin, and they're forbidden from marrying a widow. Now, the Rambam explains that there's a fundamental difference between a Kohen's prohibitions and a Kohen Gadol's prohibitions. Let's take a look back at the Kohen's prohibitions. The Rambam says, Kol Kohen, shenasa achas mehashalish nashim elu. Any Kohen who first formally married one of these 3 women, Bein Gadol, Bein Hedyot, whether he is a high priest or a regular priest, Uba'al, and then he engages in relations, Loike, that's when he gets lashes. 2 steps have to happen. You have to first formally consecrate, begin the marriage, and also have relations. If you only had promiscuous relations, the Kohen, with one of these three women, you don't get lashes on account of violating this prohibition of marrying these three women. Shenemar, because the Torah describes the prohibition as lo yikachu. They shall not take. Take in the Torah is a reference to the formal acquisition that we do in marriage. So in order for them to violate the prohibition, they have to take the woman in marriage, give them a ring, do a proper consecration, and only then have relations. If they jump the gun and only have relations, they don't get lashes on these accounts. They get lashes for other reasons. The Rambam explained in the beginning of the 4th book that any Kohen who engages promiscuously in relations gets lashes. Separate thing. But for these three special prohibitions, he doesn't get held accountable. However, that's only true for the basic three. The basic three that are forbidden to every Kohen. Aval Kohen Gadol sheba al almana. But if the high priest were simply to just have relations with the widow, which is the additional woman, who's forbidden to him, loike achas afal pisha loikidesh. He gets one set of lashes, even if he didn't do a formal consecration. And the reason for this is interesting. Shenemar, because the verse says at the end, loy yechalel. He shouldn't marry these women so that he doesn't desecrate them. Now, literally in context, the Torah is talking about desecrating his kids. V'lo yechalel zaroi be'amav. If the Kohen Gadol were to marry one of these women, his kids will be desecrated. The Talmud, though, says that we can read the words lo yechalel separately, which means simply by transgressing this prohibition and marrying this woman, he desecrates her. Shenemar lo yechalel kevan sheba'ala chilala upasla lakahuna. It's once he has relations with her that he has desecrated her and disqualified her from marrying a priest. Aval zayna v'chalala ugrusha, but the other three women, the woman who engaged in a forbidden relationship, the woman who's a product of a Kohen forbidden relationship, and the divorcee, before he has relations with them, they're already disqualified from a Kohen. The widow, it only takes effect when he has relations. So therefore, because there's this essential difference between them, therefore, the Kohen Gadol alone, only him, gets lashes just for relations with the widow. And even though there is no formal consecration, because by dint of his relations, he has desecrated her, and the Torah says, don't desecrate. He is warned against desecrating kosher women, not them and not their children. So therefore, since by marrying the widow he desecrates her, that shows that the marriage itself, or the relations themselves, are the prohibition. And so he gets lashes just for the relations.
He gets the lashes and then he's off.
Huh?
Then he can become a Kohen Gadol.
He can keep on being the Kohen Gadol, yeah. But he gets punished for this prohibition. Now if he does both, Kidesh Kohen Gadol Almona Uba Allah, if he goes through the formal stages of consecrating this widow, and then he has relations with her, like Geshtayim, now he gets two sets of lashes. Achas Mishum, Almona Lo Yikach, one for the red letters here, Almana Lo Yikach, he shall not marry a widow. Yikach means formally married. By formally consecrating her, he violates this prohibition. The achas mishum lo yechalel, and a second one for not desecrating, which he did by having relations with her. He desecrates her, so he gets two sets of lashes. Ubein kohen gadol, ubein kohen hedyet. Shenasa isha min ha'arba v'lo baal. Either way, whether you're a regular priest or a high priest, if you only do the formal step but never actually have relations, ein eloka, you don't get lashes. So it's funny. The lashes come for the relations, but the relations have to be preceded by a formal marriage in order to get you the lashes. So you need the final step, but you also need the first step. If you only have the first step without the last step, you don't get lashes. It says that even though we're describing these prohibitions on the men, on the Kohanim, the Chol Makom Shehu Loike, He Loika, wherever the Kohen gets lashes for transgressing his prohibition, the woman with whom he's involved also gets lashes. The Chol Makom Shehu Eine Loike, He Eine Loika. If the Kohen doesn't get the lashes, neither does she. She'ein hefresh bein ish le'isha la'oinshin. There's no difference in the Torah between man and woman for punishment. Whatever punishment is imposed on the man is imposed on the woman when they're involved in a forbidden act. Zulasi b'shivcha charufa bilvad, with one exception of the half-slave, half-free maidservant who is consecrated to another servant. If somebody has relations with her, as we explained in chapter 3, she has a very unique law in which she gets lashes and the man does not. He only has to bring a sacrifice. Says that Rambam halachavav kol kohen haba al hakusis. If a kohen has relations with a non-Jewish woman, bein gadol bein hedyet, whether high priest or a regular priest, loike mishum zayna, right away, just for the relations, he gets lashes on account of marrying a woman who has engaged in a forbidden relationship. Even though we just said that regularly a Kohen has to have a formal marriage and only then have relations. Here, with a non-Jewish woman, just for the relations he's liable. Why? Because you can't make a formal marriage with a non-Jew. Share'eina bas kiddushin, she isn't eligible to be consecrated. So all you have left is the final step of relations. The fact of the matter is, a Kohen cannot have relations with a woman who previously engaged in a forbidden relationship, whether she's a Jew or a non-Jew. So by the non-Jew, since you don't have the option of doing the formal consecration, it's not required. Just the relations already gets you the lashes.
There's a difference in the gear saying.
What do you have there?
Instead of saying kusis, it says goy.
Yes. Many, many times in this Rambam, in the Moznaim Rambam, they put kusi or kusis as a description of a Gentile, and in other manuscripts they have the word goy or akum. Yeah, it says that Rambam halacha zayin hachalutza, a woman who did chalitza. We love these pictures. We spent much time on them. Classic case, right? We have a man dies childless. He leaves his wife as a widow. This brother, the brother of the deceased, has two options. Either he can marry her, that's yibum, or if they don't want the marriage to go forward, they dissolve the bond by doing chalitza. It's a whole process with the removing of the shoe, etc. Let's say he does chalitza. Once he does chalitza, this woman is now known as a chalutza, a woman who has had chalitza done to her. And the sages said, Asura lekoyin midivrei soifrim. She's going to be forbidden to a Kohen rabbinically, because she looks like a divorcee. It's the same concept. Right? A regular woman was in a marriage. She's dissolved from the marriage, released from the marriage by a divorce. So to this woman, she was bound to the brother, and by virtue of the ceremony, she became dissolved. So we treat her like a divorcee, and a Kohen cannot marry her rabbinically. And if a Kohen marries this woman, this chalutza, he's going to get rabbinic lashes. What if a Kohen married a woman whose chalitza was in doubt? We don't know if she's for sure a chalutza. Let's say there was a question if the brother-in-law should have even done chalutza, or maybe he wasn't even the brother-in-law. Like we had these cases in the laws of Yibam and Chalitza. So if the Kohen marries her, we're not going to force her out. We're going to treat her as a kosher woman, so are the babies. They're not going to be desecrated. They're not going to be products of forbidden Kohen relationships. The sages never decreed about doubtful chalutzas, only about definite chalutzas. Same thing if you had a woman who was, she was a divorcee in doubt. That means the husband during the lifetime gave her a divorce, which we're not sure if it's valid, then he dies. So the question is she a divorcee or is she a widow? If the divorce was valid, she's a divorcee. If the divorce wasn't valid, she's a widow. So we don't know if she's a divorcee. Or for a Kohen Gadol, we don't know if she's a widow. She's a questionable widow. Questionable widow would mean we don't know if the ring that was given to her was a good ring. The husband consecrates a marriage. We don't know if the consecration was good. Then he drops dead. So if the consecration was good, she's a widow. If not, she's just an unmarried woman. What do we do about that? Same thing if there was a doubt whether she engaged in a forbidden relationship, a doubt whether she's a product of a Kohen forbidden union. In all these cases, the Kohen will be given rabbinic lashes and he has to divorce this woman. Now, because the Rambam is talking about multiple layers of prohibitions on Kohanim, we're going to introduce a very fundamental principle in all of Jewish law. It's a major principle in all prohibitions of the Torah. She'ein isur chol al isur. We're going to define this like this. One prohibition cannot land on another prohibition, which means a prohibition doesn't take effect while another prohibition is in effect. Unless, three exceptions. Elohim kain hayu shnei yisurin bayin ka'achas, unless both prohibitions came at once. Explain to you what that means in a second. Oisha haya ha'isur ha'echad, moisif dvarim acherim al oisei ha'isur. Or, the second prohibition adds an extra layer of prohibition on the original one. The Rambam will exemplify this in a minute. Or if the second prohibition was more encompassing. So the examples in this chapter are only for category number 2. So we're going to go through the other 2 just to see an example of that. Shnei yisurin bayin ka'achas, 2 prohibitions at once. The classic example that's given is if you have a cow. Okay? There's a prohibition to eat treifa. Treifa means an animal that cannot live more than 12 months. If an animal is wounded in a way that you cannot live more than 12 months, its meat is forbidden for consumption. That's A. There's a second prohibition to eat Eiver min hachai, to eat a limb from a live animal. So watch what happens. A person goes over to a cow and pulls off its leg. detaches its leg. Two things have happened at once. Number one, he's removed a limb from a living animal. Number two, by removing this limb, he has converted the animal into a treifa. It becomes terminally ill, it can't live for 12 months without a leg. So now, since these two prohibitions landed at once, they take effect both on the piece of meat, and if you eat that leg, you're liable on 2 counts. Both for a limb and for treifa.
Even if you shecht it properly after you take it.
Even if it's properly after you take it, it's problematic. That's an example of 2 prohibitions coming at once. Now, let's see an example of when a second prohibition adds more prohibition to the original. Let's see what this means. Says the Rambam, lefichach, therefore. Let's talk about it in Kohen terms. Isha shahoisa almona. You have a woman who was married, she became a widow. She got remarried, v'nases grusha, and she became a divorcee. Her second husband divorced her. Then, v'nases chalala. Then, she engages in a forbidden union with a Kohen, because she's a divorcee, right? And she becomes a chalala, now she becomes desecrated. Then, v'nases zaina. Then she goes and engages in a forbidden relationship with a Jew, and she becomes a zaina. Now she's got 4 separate counts on her body. She's a widow, she's a divorcee, she's desecrated by a Kohen, and engaged in a forbidden relationship. If then the high priest has relations with her, he's going to get 4 sets of lashes for one relation. Now why? If one prohibition can't take effect, while another prohibition is already in effect, so the minute she became a widow, the fact that later on she became a divorcee shouldn't add anything. But the Rambam says it does. Why? Because this is Isur Moisif. This is adding extra layers of prohibition. Watch this. Okay, and we'll follow the squares to give us the indication. Lefi, because as follows. Shoha almana asura lekohen gadol. The moment she became a widow, when the red square fell upon her, first marriage, her husband dies, she becomes a widow. How many kohanim is she forbidden to? Only one. She's forbidden only to a Kohen Gadol, umuteres lahedit, she's permitted to a regular Kohen. Chazra Liyah is grusha. The moment she becomes divorced in her second marriage, another layer of prohibition is added to her. Now, not only is she prohibited to a Kohen Gadol, now she's also prohibited to a Kohen Hedyot, a regular Kohen. Noisaf ba Isur, v'ne'aseres leKohen Hedyot. Another layer of prohibition has been added to her. She's become forbidden to a regular Kohen. Lefichach, therefore, Noisaf ba Isur acher al Isur ha'almana. The additional layer of prohibition takes effect over and above the prohibition of a widow. And so now this guy, the Kohen Gadol, is going to be liable on 2 counts, because the second situation has put more prohibition on her, including the regular Kohen. Let's go further. The principle is, even once a woman gets divorced, if she was the daughter of a Kohen, she can go back to her father's house and eat the special Kohen food. Truma, the first 2% taken from grain by every farmer, is eaten only by Kohanim. She, if she gets divorced, she can go back to her father's house and eat Truma. So in that way, she still has the status of a Kohen. Nases chalala, the moment she engages in a forbidden Kohen relationship and becomes desecrated, noisaf ba isur, additional layer of prohibition takes effect on her. She becomes forbidden, shari neseres bitruma, she becomes forbidden to eat Truma. And therefore, because an extra layer of prohibition took effect on her, that extra prohibition now transfers back both to the regular Kohen and to the Kohen Gadol. Now he's got 3 counts. But a woman who is in this situation is still allowed to marry a regular Jew. Nases zoina, once she becomes a zoina by engaging in a forbidden relationship to her, hoyil v'yesh znus she'oisra al Yisrael. Since there is a type of prostitution, there's a type of adultery where a woman will become forbidden to a regular husband, a regular Jew. For example, im zinsa ishtei b'ratzain, if a man's wife commits adultery willingly, she becomes forbidden to her husband. So since conceptually the idea of a zoina can forbid her on a 4th layer, on a regular Jew, noisaf ba isur acher, another layer of prohibition is added to her as well, to the Kohen Gadol, and therefore, when he goes and has relations with this woman, he gets liable for all 4 counts. Same thing, by the way, if we move down one level just to the regular Kohen. Same law would apply to a regular Kohen. Sheba al hagrusha, shenases chalola, the achar kach zoina, if he marries a divorcee who had become later desecrated and then become a zoina in that order, so then he gets 3 lashes. He gets 3 lashes for one relation. Of course, the widow won't matter because he's not forbidden to marry a widow. but he'll get 3 for these 3. However, the operative word or the operative concept is that it has to happen in this order, because only in this order does the prohibitions keep on expanding to more and more layers. Aval im nishtana seder zeh, but if the order is altered, it's changed, meaning, let's say she was first a zayna. First thing the woman did was she engaged in a forbidden relationship with a regular Jew. So right away at this moment, she becomes forbidden on all 4 levels. There's nothing additional that can take effect after this. So therefore, if then she becomes a divorcee, let's say, it won't matter. The Kohen will only get lashes one time. He only gets lashes once, because the original prohibition doesn't have any more layers added to it. Now, on the same note, the Rambam says, if a woman is widowed from multiple husbands or divorced from multiple husbands, the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol will only get lashes once for each relation, because the multiple divorces don't add more layers of prohibition. Okay. And by the way, the Rambam says what qualifies as a widow? Almana ben min ha'erisin ben min ha'nisuin asura. A widow, whether she's only been consecrated or fully consummated, whether her marriage took effect fully or not, asura, she's forbidden to a high priest. Now, before we go on, let's take a look at the other type of prohibition which takes effect on other prohibitions, which the Rambam called Isur Koilel, a more encompassing prohibition. You have a more encompassing prohibition. The example that's given for this is there's a nerve in every animal called the Gid HaNasha, the sciatic nerve, which is forbidden for consumption. Okay? That nerve is forbidden no matter how healthy the animal is. Now, let's say one day the animal gets wounded in a way that it becomes terminally ill. It's not going to last for more than 12 months. Now it becomes a treifa. Now, the concept of treifa applies to the entire body. So since the prohibition of treifa encompasses the entire body, it also encompasses the sciatic nerve. And therefore the sciatic nerve is now holds you liable on 2 counts. If you were to eat it, you get lashes both for the sciatic nerve and for eating a treifa. Okay, back to the Rambam. Halacha Yud Beis. Kohen Gadol shemeis achiv. Let's go back to the case of Yibum. You have a Kohen Gadol who has a brother, of course, who's a regular Kohen. The regular Kohen dies, childless. Afal pishu humina erusin, even though he only consecrated his wife, never consummated the marriage, hareze lo yiyabim elochaylitz. The Kohen Gadol should not go ahead and do Yibum. That would be considered basically marrying a widow. Instead, he should do chalitza. Now, more precisely, as we learned in the laws of Yibum, the truth is that a Kohen Gadol technically could marry her. He could do Yibum, because the positive commandment of Yibum overrides the negative commandment of taking a widow in marriage. However, the permission granted by Yibum is only to have relations once. Once he has relations once, he's fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, and any additional times, all he will have is the prohibition of marrying a widow. And at that point, the positive commandment won't override it. Therefore, the sages said, better avoid Yibum at all, only do chalitza. Here was the case that you guys were asking, similar concept. Kohen, a regular Kohen. Okay, forget the Kohen Gadol, make believe he's a regular Kohen. Regular Kohen has a brother who dies, leaving a Yevama, leaving a woman waiting in the wings. While he's in the wings, while they're waiting, he becomes appointed to the office of the high priest. Even if he gave that formal consecration. Remember the Yibum, typically, you don't have to do any act of kiddushin biblically. Just have relations, and that's how you consummate the marriage. But the sages said you should do maimar. You should give a formal act of acquisition even to this woman. So even if he gave that act while he was a regular Kohen, so in a way he's already began the marriage, he should not do the Yibum. He should not finish the Yibum after being appointed. Simply do the chalitza. But if it wasn't a case of Yibum, a regular case, which is actually the case you asked before, a Kohen, a regular Kohen, consecrates a widow. It's allowed. No problem with a widow. Gives a widow a ring. The Nisman Aliyas Kohen Gadol. Before he has a chance to consummate the marriage, he's appointed as a Kohen Gadol. Says the Rambam here, you could marry her after you've been appointed, because you already began the process before. If a woman was consecrated out of doubt, we weren't sure if it took effect, and that man dies, now she's a doubtful widow, and as we said before, ideally a Kohen Gadol should not marry her. Now that we've talked about the prohibitions, let's focus on the positive commandment. We saw this before, shortly, and now we'll look back at it. The Kohen Gadol, it says, V'hu isha vivsuleha yikach. He has to marry a virgin woman. That's the only woman he can marry. So the Rambam explains this. Yud Gimel. Mitzvah saseh al Kohen Gadol sheyisa nara besula. A Kohen Gadol has a positive commandment to marry a nara. A nara is that stage, that 6-month stage, after the woman manifests signs of physical maturity. For 6 months afterwards, she's called a nara. And she has to be virgin. Umisha tivgar te'aser alav. The moment she becomes full majority, past those 6 months, she can no longer marry him. Of course, if he married her while she was a maiden, then they stay married. But the point is, he cannot marry her once she's reached the stage of bogeret. Shenemar, as it says, V'hu isha vivsuleha yikach. He must take a woman in her virginity. Isha like Tana. Isha means not a minor, a woman not a minor. Bivsuleha v'loy bageres. In her virginity, not full majority, where typically women would lose their full status of virginity. Ha-ketza, what does that mean? Yatzas miklal katnos v'lichlal bagros loiba. A woman who has left status of minority and hasn't yet reached full majority. Zunara, which is the nara in that 6-month stage in between. A Kohen Gadol can never marry 2 wives ever at once. Shenemar, as it says, Isha, 1 woman, achas v'lo shtayim, 1 and not 2. Yudalit. Kohen Gadol leisa mukasetz. What if a woman lost her virginity not through relations, but through an accident? She was hit by a piece of wood. He should still not marry her. Afal pisha loy nivala, even though she never had relations. Nivala shaloi kedarka. If a woman had relations in the unnatural way from behind, it's as though she had relations in the regular way, and she's forbidden, no longer considered to be a virgin. If a woman had relations, and the commentaries explain that it means from behind, unnaturally, with an animal, she is permitted. That doesn't disqualify her from being a virgin. Tesvav, Kohen Gadol shenasa be'ula. What if a Kohen Gadol married a woman who already had relations, promiscuously, out of wedlock? So she's not a widow, because she was never formally married, but she had relations. No lashes, but he must divorce her. If he married a technical virgin, she's just reached majority or been hit by a piece of wood, he can keep her. A regular Kohen consecrates a woman who has had relations and then he's appointed to be a Kohen Gadol before he gets a chance to consummate the marriage. He may consummate the marriage after being appointed. Halacha tezayin. We had this law in the end of the 4th book when we were talking about the laws of the rapist and the seducer. Anas nara besula oipita oisa. A Kohen Gadol rapes or seduces a virgin girl. Afilu ansa oipita oisa keshu kohen hedyot. Even if he raped her or seduced her when he was a regular Kohen, v'nismana Kohen Gadol kedim sheyichnes, and was appointed as a Kohen Gadol before he has a chance to marry her as he is supposed to. Hareza lo yichnes, he may not marry her. She's no longer a virgin, even though he was the one who made her not a virgin. Doesn't matter. If he marries her, in fact, he has to divorce her. This is another example of halacha just being super dry. Of course, if you mix your emotions into it, like how is he even a Kohen Gadol? Like who even appointed him? Or how is he even keeping his office? Of course. But we're talking about the dry law. How does the Kohen Gadol play in to these halachot? This is how it is. Yud Zayin, Eiras HaSaktana, Ubagra Tachtav Kaidem Nisuin. A Kohen Gadol consecrates a minor girl. Before he has a chance to consummate the marriage, she attains majority. Do not marry her. Her body has undergone a change. But if he does marry her, no need to divorce her, because bottom line is she's a virgin. Halacha Yud Ches, how do we define divorcee? Achas grusha mina eiros sinemin nisuin. A woman who is divorced, whether from a marriage where she was only consecrated or actually consummated. If that marriage ends in divorce, she's considered to be a divorcee. Aval hamimo enes, but a woman who says miun, she's a refusal. That's the woman who her father dies while she's a minor. Her mother or her brothers marry her off. The sages said that will allow the marriage to go forward just to ensure her support. But if she wants to dissolve the marriage, no divorce is required. She simply gets up and says, I refuse the marriage, I'm done, and she's out of the marriage. So when a woman does that, afilu gersha beget vehechazira umeanabai, even if that husband had first given her a proper bill of divorce and then remarried her, and she said refusal, she's permitted to a Kohen, as we explained, because a divorce given to this minor child is totally meaningless. It has no significance, as we explain the laws of gerushin, laws of divorce, and therefore she's not considered a divorcee. Any woman who is not fitting to have the chalitza right done to her, for example, the commentaries say a woman who was pregnant, her husband died, childless, thinking, then it's revealed that she's pregnant. She wasn't supposed to do chalitza. So even im nechlitza, even if she undergoes the chalitza right, lai nisla lekahuna, she doesn't become disqualified for a Kohen because she was never meant to do it in the beginning. So it turns out that it's a meaningless act. Yutes, yotza aleha koil. Interesting case. Okay, follow this. A Kohen is married to a woman, totally fine. Yatsa aleha koil. A rumor then goes out that says, Ish pleini Kohen, kasav get li ishtai, ay nasan get li ishtai. This Kohen who's married to that woman, there's a rumor, no actual testimony. There's a rumor that he wrote a divorce to his wife or gave a divorce to his wife, and nevertheless, she's married to him. She's still serving him. Basically, there's a rumor going around that he divorced his wife and remarried her, which for a regular Jew is totally fine, to remarry your divorcee. But for a Kohen, of course, exactly, yeah. But for a Kohen, it's forbidden. So there's a rumor going around that a Kohen remarried his divorcee. We don't take her out from her husband. Why? Because the last presumption that we have is that they're properly married. There's only a rumor to the divorce, no issue. However, if she really does leave that first Kohen, say the Kohen dies, leaving her a widow, and she gets married to another Kohen, now we do take that rumor into account and we say, you know what, maybe she was a divorcee. And we're going to force her out of this relationship because this Kohen basically married a divorcee. So we take the rumor both ways. If the rumor came after the marriage, in the first case, we let her stay married. If it came before the marriage, we force her out of the marriage. There's a rumor going around the city that this woman was consecrated and then divorced from the consecration. Never consummated the marriage. We worry, we suspect this, as we explained in the laws of divorce, and a Kohen cannot marry her. But if a rumor is circulating that she underwent the chalitza rite, and we don't have explicit testimony to that effect, we don't worry, and we allow her to marry a Kohen. If there's a virgin, we know she's a virgin, that's the last thing we know. And then there's a rumor going around that she had relations promiscuously, out of wedlock. We don't worry about her, and she can even marry a high priest. If a rumor is going around that she is a maidservant, we also don't worry about her. And she can marry even a regular Kohen. We assume she's a regular status. If a circulation is going around, the rumor is going around that she is promiscuous, we also don't worry about her. Just rumors are not good enough to have us treat a Jewish woman as lower than. Even if she was married and the husband had divorced her for transgressing what's called the Jewish law, where she acts frivolously with young men and she goes out with her hair uncovered, those kinds of things. Or there's witnesses to a unseemly matter, like the example that was given in the other book, where you walk into a room and there's a man and woman putting on their pants, so you don't have any testimony, but it looks bad. And that husband, before he had a chance to give her this divorce for the unseemly conduct, he dies. She's allowed to marry a Kohen. We don't consider her to be a divorcee. We never forbid a woman in this type of category unless we have clear testimony or her own admission. And the Rebbe once said, see, the Rambam concludes the chapter with the advantages of a Jewish girl, how she's innocent till proven guilty. We never impose a status of less than to a Jewish woman. We consider her to be pure, to be well behaved, unless of course it's clarified. But otherwise, she's presumed to be innocent and allowed to marry a Kohen or even a Kohen Gadol.